The winter air was sharp that evening, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you pull your coat tighter. Bristol was alive with the anticipation of Christmas shop windows glowing with fairy lights, couples hurrying home with last-minute gifts, the scent of roasted chestnuts lingering in the streets. But beneath the festive warmth, there was an eerie stillness. It was December 17th, 2010. A night that should have been unremarkable. 25-year-old Joanna Yeats had just finished her shift at the architecture firm where she worked. It had been a long week, but the weekend had finally arrived, and with it, the promise of cozy nights and holiday cheer. Joanna was the kind of person who filled a room with warmth. She had a natural energy about her, bright, ambitious, loved by friends and colleagues. She lived in Clifton, a quiet, affluent area of Bristol, with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Their apartment was small but charming, a space they had turned into a home together. That night, Greg was away visiting family in Sheffield, leaving Joanna to enjoy a quiet evening alone. She had plans she would never get to fulfill. At around 8 in the evening, Joanna left her office, stepping into the cold night. CCTV cameras picked her up as she made her way home, her figure small against the backdrop of city lights. She stopped at a local grocery store, a familiar routine. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the shelves lined with holiday treats. She picked up a pizza and a bottle of cider simple comforts for a Friday night in. The store's security footage showed her at the self-checkout, scanning her items with ease. She looked calm, casual. Nothing seemed unusual. As she exited the store, the world outside was quiet. There were no signs of distress, no one lurking in the shadows, no one following her. She walked the short distance home, a walk she had taken countless times before. What happened after she stepped through her front door, no one knew. Saturday morning arrived, bringing with it the usual weekend bustle. Friends were out finishing last-minute Christmas shopping, families gathered for early celebrations, and the world carried on as if nothing was amiss. But something was wrong. Joanna Yeats was supposed to meet friends that day. She never showed up. Texts went unanswered. Calls rang through to voicemail. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she had overslept. Maybe she had changed her plans. But as the hours passed, concern began to creep in. Her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, was still in Sheffield, unaware that anything was wrong. He had spoken to Joanna briefly the night before. Everything had seemed fine. She had sounded normal, happy even. But now she wasn't responding. By Sunday evening, Greg made the drive back to Bristol, the unease growing with every mile. When he arrived at their Clifton apartment, everything looked just as he had left it. The door was locked, no signs of forced entry. Then he stepped inside. Greg called out her name. Silence. His eyes scanned the apartment. Nothing looked disturbed. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no immediate signs that something terrible had happened. But then he noticed something strange. Joanna's coat was hanging by the door. Her shoes were neatly placed beside it. Her purse sat on the table. Her phone was still there, untouched. The bottle of cider she had bought from the store was unopened, and the pizza, her simple Friday night dinner, was still in its packaging, uneaten. It was as if she had stepped inside, set everything down, and vanished. Greg's heart pounded. He tried to push back the panic clawing at his chest. Maybe she had gone out with friends. Maybe she had stayed somewhere overnight. But deep down, he knew Joanna wouldn't have left without her phone. Something was terribly wrong. By the time Greg Reardon called the police, panic had fully set in. This wasn't just a missed text or a last-minute change of plans. Joanna was gone. Authorities arrived at the Clifton apartment, looking for anything that might explain her disappearance. There was no sign of forced entry, no blood, no struggle. It was as if she had walked out into the night and never returned. Greg, along with Joanna's family and friends, desperately spread the word. Flyers were printed and plastered across Bristol. The media picked up the story, broadcasting Joanna's face on every news channel. Social media lit up with messages of concern, urging anyone with information to come forward. People wanted to believe she was still out there. Maybe she had been taken, held somewhere against her will. Maybe she had suffered an accident and was waiting to be found. But as the days passed and the December cold settled in, hope began to wither. Somewhere deep down, everyone feared the worst. It was December 25th, Christmas Day. Families were gathered around their trees, laughter echoing from warm homes. But a few miles from Clifton, in the quiet countryside of Fayland, something sinister lay hidden beneath the snow. A couple was out walking their dog along a remote stretch of land. The air was crisp, the ground frozen beneath their boots. The dog ran ahead, its nose to the ground, sniffing excitedly at something near the edge of a wooded area. Then silence, a sudden hesitation. The couple caught up, their breath visible in the icy air. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at. A bundle partially buried in the snow, clothes stiff from the cold. And then realization set in. It was a woman's body. Panic surged through them. They called the police, their voices shaking as they described what they had found. Within hours, forensic teams arrived, their boots crunching against the frozen earth as they secured the scene. The worst fear had been realized. Joanna Yeats had been found. But the mystery was far from over, because there were no obvious injuries, no blood, no clear sign of what had happened to her. The question now wasn't just who had taken her, it was how she had died. At first, investigators held onto a sliver of hope. Maybe Joanna had wandered off in the freezing cold and succumbed to the elements. Maybe this was a tragic accident. But the autopsy confirmed the worst. Joanna Yeats had been strangled. The bruising around her neck told the story someone had wrapped their hands around her throat and squeezed the life out of her. It was a slow, deliberate act, one that required time, pressure, and intent. There were no defensive wounds, no signs that she had fought back. Either she had been taken by surprise or overpowered before she had the chance to resist. Worse still, there was little forensic evidence at the scene. No clear footprints leading to or from her body. No weapon, no DNA from a stranger. The snowfall had worked against investigators, erasing whatever clues might have been left behind. What had started as a missing persons case had now become a full-scale murder investigation, and the most terrifying thought of all, Joanna's killer was still out there. As word of Joanna's murder spread, public outrage ignited. This wasn't just a crime, it was a violation of everything people thought was safe. She had been taken from her own home, from a city street, from a life she was still building. And whoever had done it was walking free, blending into the holiday crowds, a shadow among the festive lights. The media swarmed Clifton, reporters camped outside the apartment complex, cameras flashing every time detectives came and went. People demanded answers. Who would kill Joanna? Detectives faced a grim reality. There had been no signs of forced entry at her apartment. No one had reported screams or sounds of a struggle. No suspicious activity had been recorded in the days leading up to her disappearance. But someone had been with her that night. Someone had strangled her and dumped her body miles away. The pressure to find the killer was mounting fast. And then the first real suspect emerged. With no solid leads and growing public pressure, investigators turned their attention to someone close to home. Christopher Jeffries. He wasn't a random suspect, he was Joanna's landlord, an eccentric, well-educated retired teacher who lived in the same apartment complex. He had been one of the last people to see her alive. Jeffries was known in the neighborhood. Thin, with wild white hair and a sharp, almost theatrical way of speaking, he was the kind of man people either found fascinating or unsettling. He had a habit of watching things, people, cars, the street below. Some neighbors found him harmless. Others thought he was odd, maybe even a little creepy. When reporters got wind that police were questioning him, the tabloids pounced. His peculiar mannerisms became headlines. The strange man next door, what does he know? Weird, reclusive landlord questioned in murder case. Then came the arrest. On December 31st, detectives took Jeffries into custody on suspicion of murder. It seemed like the breakthrough the case needed. If he was the killer, it would explain how Joanna had been taken without signs of forced entry. He had access to the building. He lived right there. But as investigators dug deeper, the cracks in the theory began to show. There was no DNA linking Jeffries to the crime, no history of violence, no evidence that he had ever been inside Joanna's apartment. He denied any involvement, and after 2 days of relentless questioning, police had to admit the truth. They had nothing. Christopher Jeffries was released without charge. The media had crucified an innocent man, and the real killer, he was still out there. As the investigation dragged on, it seemed like the case was slipping away. Joanna's funeral had passed. The public was growing restless. Police had burned their first suspect. But behind the scenes, forensic scientists were still working. That's when they found something. Something so small it had almost gone unnoticed. A single speck of glitter. It was found on Joanna's body, barely visible, almost meaningless. Glitter could come from anywhere, from Christmas decorations, from clothing, from a greeting card. It was easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But this wasn't just any glitter. When tested, it matched a specific type, one that wasn't common. And in a bizarre twist, police found that exact same glitter somewhere else, on a Christmas card. A Christmas card inside the apartment of another man. A man who had already spoken to police. A man who had even offered condolences, appearing calm, helpful. Joanna's neighbor, Vincent Tabak. It was the kind of clue that could have been dismissed in an instant, a single fleck of glitter. But forensic analysts weren't willing to overlook anything. They ran tests, examining the microscopic fragments found on Joanna's body. This wasn't ordinary glitter from wrapping paper or decorations. It was a unique type, the kind often found on greeting cards. It was a long shot, but investigators followed the lead. That's when they found something disturbing. Inside the apartment of one of Joanna's neighbors, they discovered a Christmas card with the exact same type of glitter. The forensic match was undeniable. The particles found on Joanna had come from this card. But how? For the first time, police had something physical, a direct connection between the crime scene and someone who had been right next door the entire time. Someone who had already spoken to investigators. Someone who had presented himself as nothing more than a concerned neighbor. His name was Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch engineer, quiet, reserved, with a successful career. He wasn't the kind of person who attracted attention. Unlike Christopher Jeffries, there was nothing outwardly strange about him. No wild hair, no odd behavior. He was just another professional living in Clifton, another face in the crowd. Tabak had even spoken to reporters in the days after Joanna's disappearance, expressing sympathy, shaking his head at the tragedy. He had reassured his girlfriend, Tanya Morrison, that he had nothing to worry about. He had cooperated with the police. He didn't seem like a murderer. But forensic evidence was beginning to tell a different story. That single speck of glitter had led investigators straight to him. And when they started looking deeper, What they found changed everything. The glitter had led them to Vincent Tabak, but investigators needed more. A speck of glitter alone wasn't enough to secure a conviction, so they took the next step. Tabak had voluntarily provided a DNA sample early in the investigation, back when he was just another neighbor offering to help. At the time, no one had suspected him. But now, with suspicion growing, forensic experts tested his sample against new evidence found on Joanna's body. The results were undeniable. His DNA was there, on Joanna's clothing, on her skin. The polite, quiet engineer wasn't just a helpful neighbor. He wasn't just an unlucky man who happened to live next door to a murder victim. He was the killer. Now, police had everything they needed. On January 20th, detectives arrived at Vincent Tabak's apartment. This time, they weren't there to ask him questions. They were there to take him away. When the door opened, the man standing behind it looked nothing like the cold-blooded killer they now knew him to be. He was calm, collected, almost indifferent. But behind his blank expression, something had changed. The man who had once spoken to reporters offering condolences for Joanna's death was now the prime suspect in her murder. As officers placed him in handcuffs and led him away, neighbors watched in stunned silence. Many had seen him every day walking to work, carrying groceries, blending into the background. No one had ever looked twice. But now, everyone had the same question burning in their minds. Why? Why would a man with no history of violence, no connection to crime, suddenly commit such a brutal act? And what had really happened behind Joanna's locked door that night? At first, Vincent Tabak denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with Joanna's murder. But when confronted with the forensic evidence, the DNA, the glitter, the traces of him on her body, his calm exterior began to crack. Then the confession came. Tabak admitted that he had been inside Joanna's flat. He claimed he had misread the situation, that he had made a move toward her and panicked when she resisted. In his version of events, her death was sudden, accidental, a tragic mistake. But forensic science told a different story. Joanna had been strangled for over 20 seconds. That wasn't panic. That wasn't a loss of control. That was deliberate. Strangulation isn't immediate. It takes force, sustained pressure. A person struggles. They fight for air. Their body desperately resists death. For over 20 seconds, Joanna's killer had kept his grip tight, watching as her life slipped away. And when it was over, he didn't call for help. He didn't try to undo what he had done. Instead, he began covering his tracks. Even before police had suspected him, Vincent Tabak had already been trying to manipulate the truth. He sent fake texts pretending to be Joanna, making it seem as though she was still alive. He researched strangulation online, reading articles about how long it takes, what signs it leaves behind. He didn't stop there. He also looked up how to dispose of a body. Investigators discovered that in the days following Joanna's murder, Tabak had visited multiple websites about hiding corpses, forensic detection methods, and real-life murder cases. He had been methodical, calculated. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And yet, he had made one crucial mistake. He thought he had wiped away every trace of his crime. But a single speck of glitter, something so small, so insignificant, had been the thread that unraveled everything. The trial of Vincent Tabak began in October 2011. The courtroom was packed reporters, members of the public, Joanna's devastated family, and Tabak himself seated in the dock, his once calm demeanor now shadowed by the weight of what he had done. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling his carefully constructed lies. They laid out the facts. Tabak had strangled Joanna for over 20 seconds, long enough for her to struggle, long enough for him to stop, but he never did. He had carried her lifeless body out of her flat and dumped it miles away, covering her with leaves and snow. He had returned home, sent fake texts to cover his tracks, researched how to conceal a body, and even tried to place suspicion elsewhere. But when it was his turn to speak, Tabak clung to his version of the story. He admitted he had killed Joanna, but denied it was murder. He claimed he had misread the situation, that she had screamed when he got too close, and that in a moment of panic he had strangled her to stop her from alerting neighbors. He described it as an accident, something he never meant to do. But there was one problem. The evidence told a different story. The forensic reports showed that Joanna had been held down with overwhelming force. The pressure on her neck was sustained. A crime of panic would have lasted only seconds. But Tabak had continued for over 20 long enough to know exactly what he was doing. Then the prosecution introduced something even more chilling. Vincent Tabak had been looking at violent pornography, specifically images and videos of women being strangled. He had an obsession with the act of control, of dominance. And on that night, when he had seen Joanna alone, that fantasy had turned into reality. The jury listened horrified. Tabak sat there expressionless. By the time the final arguments were made, one thing was clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a brutal, calculated murder. After 2.5 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with anticipation. As the verdict was read, there was no gasp, no outburst, just a silent acceptance of what everyone already knew. Vincent Tabak was guilty of murder. The judge did not hold back. He called Tabak's crime unthinkable and depraved, highlighting his callous behavior after the fact, how he had gone to parties, texted his girlfriend as if nothing had happened, and even feigned sympathy for Joanna's parents. For his crime, Tabak was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 20 years before parole could even be considered. Justice, in the eyes of the court, had been served. But for Joanna's family, there was no justice that could bring her back. Her parents sat in the courtroom, clutching each other's hands, their faces streaked with silent grief. Their daughter, who had once laughed, dreamed, and planned for the future, was gone, and no sentence, no matter how severe, could ever change that. It was a murder case filled with uncertainty, false leads, and dead ends. A landlord falsely accused, a killer who almost got away with it. But in the end, it wasn't a witness or a confession that solved the case. It wasn't a dramatic chase or a hidden camera revealing the truth. It was something so small it could have been brushed away. A single speck of glitter. Without it, Vincent Tabak may never have been caught. He had been careful, he had erased his digital footprint, hidden Joanna's body, and manipulated the media into believing he was nothing more than a quiet, grieving neighbor. But that microscopic fragment, barely visible to the naked eye, had led investigators straight to him. It was the thread that unraveled his entire story. And it proved, once again, that in the world of forensic science, no detail is too small. Because sometimes the most insignificant things, the ones we don't even notice, can expose the darkest secrets. Even after all these years, 3 questions linger. What would have happened if forensic scientists had ignored that tiny speck of glitter? Did Tabak plan this, or was it truly a crime of opportunity? And how many killers out there are walking free simply because the right clue was never found? The truth is, forensic science has come a long way. But for every case solved by DNA, by fibers, by the tiniest of details, there are countless others that remain mysteries. We will never know how many murderers have slipped through the cracks, how many killers are still out there, how many cases like Joanna's could have gone unsolved if not for one single overlooked clue. In Joanna's case, glitter didn't just sparkle, it spoke. I've seen some strange things in crime scene reports, odd weapons, bizarre alibis, killers caught by the smallest mistakes. But this case, it had one of the most unusual clues I've ever come across: a sweet potato. And it wasn't just left at the crime scene by accident, it was used as a silencer. It was a cold February night in 2011 when police were called to a house on Murray Way in Hyannis, Massachusetts. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, a quiet, working class street where nothing like this ever happened. Inside the house, officers found Todd Lampley, a man in his 30s, lying on the floor. He had been shot multiple times. His body was sprawled near a window, the dim glow from a streetlight outside casting long shadows across the room. Blood pooled beneath him, already beginning to congeal. The scene was eerily silent. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Whoever had done this, they had been quick, precise, and deadly. As forensic teams scanned the room, they immediately spotted 3 shell casings near the body. The killer had used a firearm, but something was off. Neighbors hadn't reported hearing gunshots. In a small neighborhood like this, even one loud bang would have sent people running. But then the detectives noticed something strange on the floor: a sweet potato. It was sitting near the evidence markers, its skin slightly dented, as if it had been handled roughly. It could have been nothing, just an innocent object, maybe a piece of trash left behind, but something about it didn't feel right. Then one of the investigators crouched down for a closer look, and that's when they saw it. A bullet hole, clean and precise, running straight through the center of the potato. At first glance, it seemed absurd. A sweet potato at a murder scene, what did that have to do with anything? Could it have been some kind of bizarre accident, a random object caught in the crossfire? But when forensic investigators picked it up, they noticed something crucial. This wasn't just any potato. The hole wasn't jagged or natural. It was deliberately drilled straight through the center. Someone had modified it. That's when it hit them. This wasn't just food, it was a makeshift silencer. The idea wasn't entirely unheard of. In some criminal circles, a potato, especially a dense, starchy one, was believed to muffle the sound of gunfire. It wasn't as effective as a real silencer, but in a pinch, it could dampen the noise enough to keep people from noticing. And here's where things got even stranger. The method was notorious in pop culture. It had even been featured in the hit HBO show The Wire, where characters used sweet potatoes as gun silencers. Could this have been a coincidence? Or had the killer actually taken inspiration from a fictional crime drama? The detectives were stunned. If this theory was true, they weren't just dealing with a killer. They were dealing with someone who had carefully planned this attack. Someone who thought they were smarter than the cops. And they had just left behind the one clue that could break the case wide open. If that sounds bizarre, it's because it is. A sweet potato used as a silencer, it sounded more like an urban legend than a real crime scene discovery. But here's the unsettling part: it wasn't unheard of. This exact method had been depicted in an episode of the hit HBO show The Wire. In the series, criminals used a potato silencer to quiet gunshots and minimize evidence, and in real life, there had been rumors of similar attempts, though most of them were dismissed as impractical. It wasn't a foolproof trick. The dense, fibrous material might absorb some of the sound, but it wouldn't completely silence a gunshot. More importantly, it wouldn't eliminate all forensic traces. If anything, it created more problems than it solved. Yet, despite its flaws, someone had actually tried it, and that raised a disturbing question. Had the killer taken inspiration from fiction? And if so, what else had they learned from it? For all its strange details, the case quickly went cold. There were no immediate suspects, no witnesses had come forward, and without surveillance footage or a known enemy, police were left chasing ghosts. They combed through Todd Lampley's personal life, searching for clues, enemies, deaths, disputes, anything that could point to a suspect. But nothing stood out. Lampley had a criminal past, but it wasn't enough to suggest a clear motive. There was no evidence of a robbery, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had killed him had come with a purpose and left without a trace. The evidence, including the sweet potato silencer, was stored away in police archives, and the case faded into the background of unsolved murders. Years passed. Then, over a decade later, a single breakthrough changed everything. DNA testing. Forensic technology had advanced in ways no one could have imagined in 2011. The kind of trace evidence that once went unnoticed could now be analyzed down to the smallest detail. And when investigators decided to re-examine the case, they turned their attention back to the one piece of evidence everyone had overlooked: the sweet potato. Could it have preserved something invisible to the naked eye? The answer? Yes. In 2023, more than a decade after Todd Lampley's murder, detectives took a second look at the evidence. Cold cases like this were rarely reopened unless something new had come to light. This time, it wasn't a new witness or a confession. It was science. Forensic technology had advanced significantly since 2011. DNA testing had become more precise, more sensitive, capable of extracting genetic material from even the most unlikely objects. And there was one piece of evidence that had never been tested properly: the sweet potato. The team knew that if the killer had handled it, pressed it against the barrel of a gun, drilled a hole through its center, there was a chance they had left behind something invisible to the naked eye. They sent it to the crime lab, where forensic analysts carefully extracted what they could from its surface. The results took weeks, but when they came back, they confirmed what detectives had hoped for. There was DNA. The question now was whose? Finding DNA was only half the battle. To make an arrest, investigators needed a match and name to go with the genetic profile. Without it, the discovery meant nothing. So they went back to the original case files, searching for anyone who had been connected to Todd Lampley, even loosely. They combed through old interview notes, witness statements, phone records, and police reports. It didn't take long before a familiar name resurfaced: a man named DeVaris Hampton. His name had been in the file from the very beginning. He wasn't a stranger to Lampley. In fact, they had been linked before both had criminal pasts, and both had connections to the same circles in Hyannis. But at the time, there hadn't been enough evidence to tie Hampton to the crime. Now, investigators had something they didn't have back then: DNA. And all they had to do was compare it. From the very beginning, DeVaris Hampton had been on police radar. He wasn't just some random name in the case files. He knew Todd Lampley. They had run in the same circles, and their histories weren't exactly clean. Hampton had a criminal past, one that included violent offenses, but at the time of the murder, police had nothing solid connecting him to the crime. No eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, just rumors and suspicion. That wasn't enough to make an arrest. But now they had something they didn't have before: a way to test his DNA against the genetic material found on the sweet potato silencer. And if it matched, that would change everything. The results came back. A match. Hampton's DNA was on the sweet potato silencer. After more than 10 years, investigators finally had direct physical evidence tying him to the crime scene. But here's where things got even more damning. That wasn't the only proof they had. Because while DNA was powerful evidence, investigators had one more piece of technology on their side. And it was about to place Hampton at the scene of the crime in a way no one could dispute. At the time of the murder, DeVaris Hampton wasn't just another name on a list of suspects, he was already on probation. And that meant one crucial thing. He was being tracked. As part of his probation conditions, Hampton had been ordered to wear a GPS ankle monitor. Every movement he made was logged, minute by minute, recording his exact location. Investigators subpoenaed the GPS records from that night. If Hampton had been anywhere near Todd Lampley's house, the data would show it. They pulled the records, and what they found was shocking. The GPS data placed Hampton right at Todd Lampley's house on the night of the murder. He wasn't blocks away. He wasn't just passing through. He was there, at the exact time Lampley was shot. But that wasn't even the most damning part. The GPS also showed that the day after the shooting, Hampton had traveled to a small pond nearby, a secluded, quiet body of water, the kind of place where someone might want to get rid of something incriminating. And now, investigators had reason to believe that this pond held the next big piece of evidence, something that could seal the case for good. Detectives knew this pattern all too well. Killers often discard murder weapons in water, hoping that time, mud, and nature would erase their crimes. But time was no longer on Hampton's side. If he had thrown something into that pond, forensic science had come too far to let it stay hidden forever. The search wasn't easy. The pond was murky, filled with layers of silt and debris, and the freezing Massachusetts weather didn't help. But investigators weren't going in blind. The GPS data was precise, marking Hampton's exact movements near the water's edge. A dive team was called in. For hours, they combed the depths, scanning with metal detectors and underwater cameras, searching for anything out of place. And then they found it. Half buried beneath the mud at the bottom of the pond, divers pulled out a firearm. The moment it surfaced, everyone on the scene knew. This was it. The weapon was immediately sent for ballistics testing. If it was the gun that killed Todd Lampley, there would be no escaping the truth. It was a perfect storm of evidence. First, the sweet potato silencer with Hampton's DNA all over it. Then, the GPS data placing him exactly where and when the murder happened. Now, the gun itself recovered from the pond where Hampton's GPS showed him standing the very next day. The forensic testing came back. It was a match. This was the murder weapon. The case against Hampton was closing in fast. But there was still one lingering question, one that had haunted investigators from the start. Why? What motive did Hampton have for killing Todd Lampley? Was it a personal dispute, a robbery gone wrong, a hit ordered by someone else? Or was this a murder inspired by television, pulled straight from the pages of a crime drama? Hampton wasn't talking, and without his confession, the truth remained a chilling mystery. What was the motive? That was the question that refused to go away. Todd Lampley had a criminal past, but investigators found no immediate threats, deaths, or disputes that could explain why he was targeted that night. There were no signs of a robbery, no missing valuables, no forced entry. Whoever killed him came to kill him specifically. But why? When detectives interrogated DeVaris Hampton, he refused to cooperate. Not once did he offer an explanation, an excuse, or even a denial. Even as the evidence stacked against him, even when he was officially charged with murder in 2023, over a decade after the crime, he never said a word about why he pulled the trigger. The silence was almost as disturbing as the crime itself. But there was one theory investigators couldn't ignore. It was the most unsettling possibility of all. When police dug into Hampton's phone records, they discovered something strange. He had been watching The Wire, not just at some random point in the past, not years before, around the time of the murder. And The Wire wasn't just any show. It was one of the only mainstream crime dramas to depict the use of a sweet potato silencer. Was Hampton simply a fan of the show? A coincidence? Or was this something far darker? Had he watched the episode, seen the method, and decided to try it in real life? Had he recreated a fictional murder with real blood, a real body, and real consequences? It was a terrifying possibility. Because if true, this wasn't just a murder, it was an experiment. Hampton's trial was said to be one of the most bizarre in recent Massachusetts history. A sweet potato as a silencer, a murder possibly inspired by a TV show, and a killer who had walked free for over a decade. The story made national headlines. The sheer strangeness of the case drew comparisons to infamous crimes where criminals had mimicked movies or pop culture. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was real life. And now Hampton was about to face justice. But as prosecutors prepared for trial, another question emerged, one that no one could ignore. Was Hampton really the mastermind behind the murder? Or was there someone else involved? Some investigators believed Hampton didn't act alone. Maybe he was just the trigger man. Maybe someone else ordered the hit, planned the crime, and made sure Hampton took the fall. There was a reason to suspect it. Lampley's murder had been deliberate. Whoever did it had targeted him specifically, and they had used an unusual method, one that required some level of planning. But if there was an accomplice, they had done an incredible job covering their tracks. Because when it came down to hard evidence, there was only one name tied to the crime: DeVaris Hampton. And in court, DNA doesn't lie. Hampton was charged with first-degree murder and multiple weapons violations. The prosecution had built a solid case: DNA evidence, GPS records, and the recovered murder weapon. It was the kind of airtight evidence most cold cases never get. But Hampton's defense team wasn't giving up. They pushed back hard, arguing that while his DNA was on the sweet potato, that didn't prove he pulled the trigger. Their strategy was simple. They suggested that Hampton may have touched the potato at some point, but that didn't make him the killer. Maybe he had handled it earlier. Maybe someone else committed the murder and used a potato that just happened to have Hampton's DNA on it. It was a long shot, and the prosecution knew it. Because while the DNA alone was strong evidence, it wasn't their only proof. They had something even more damning. And when they revealed it, the defense's argument fell apart completely. The GPS data. Hampton's own court-ordered ankle monitor, the one he had been wearing as part of his probation, placed him at Todd Lampley's house on the night of the murder. Not near it, not hours before or after. Right there, at the exact time of the shooting. And if that wasn't enough, his GPS showed him traveling to the pond the very next day, the same pond where police later recovered the murder weapon. It was too much to ignore. The DNA, the GPS, the discarded gun, everything pointed to one person. And the jury agreed. After years of uncertainty, after a decade of silence, Todd Lampley's family finally had their answer. Justice had been served. The jury didn't hesitate. The evidence was overwhelming: the DNA, the GPS data, the murder weapon recovered from the pond. There was no reasonable doubt left. Devara's Hampton was convicted. Forensic science had caught up to him. Time had worked against the killer, not for him. It was a case that proved something detectives had long believed. Even the most unusual clues, a discarded potato, a random GPS record, a scene from a TV show, could become the key to solving a murder. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of emotions. For Todd Lampley's family, it was the end of a nightmare. They had spent more than a decade wondering, waiting, hoping for answers. Now they could finally stop questioning what had happened that night in 2011. But as the reporters rushed to file their stories, their headlines focusing on the bizarre nature of the crime, there was still a sense of unease. Because even though Hampton was behind bars, something about the case still felt unfinished. Something still didn't add up. There was one question that refused to go away, a question that haunted investigators even as they closed the file. Had Hampton really acted alone? The method, the calculated approach, the eerie inspiration from The Wire, was he truly the mastermind behind it all? Or was there someone else in the shadows, pulling the strings, giving the order? And if Hampton wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, then who was? Most chilling of all, if the case had never been reopened, if forensic science had never advanced, if one detective hadn't looked back at that discarded sweet potato and asked the right questions, would a vegetable have been the only witness left in the dark? I didn't expect something as ordinary as a crumpled fast food receipt to hold the key to a brutal murder. But in the world of criminal investigations, the smallest details can crack the most impossible cases. This one started on a quiet, unremarkable night in South Carolina back in 2008. The kind of night where nothing seemed out of the ordinary until everything changed. A woman was found dead inside her own home, the walls holding secrets only a killer would know. At first glance, the crime scene seemed almost too perfect. There were no shattered windows, no signs of forced entry. The victim's belongings were untouched, no ransacked drawers, no missing valuables. It was as if the killer had walked in, committed the crime, and vanished without a trace. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no security cameras. The case was slipping toward the edge of becoming another unsolved mystery. And then detectives found it. Not a weapon, not a bloody footprint, but a KFC receipt. It lay crumpled near the trash can, dismissed as nothing more than garbage, but something about it caught an investigator's eye, the timestamp. It was printed just hours before the estimated time of death. And that one insignificant piece of paper, something most of us wouldn't think twice about, was about to unravel the entire case. The victim was a woman in her 40s, a familiar face in her small town. The kind of person everyone knew, but few truly noticed until now. She had a quiet life, built on routine. Every morning, she followed the same path to work. Every evening, she made her usual stop at a local convenience store for a lottery ticket, never missing a day, always hopeful for a win that never came. Sundays were for church, and every single night, she locked her doors before going to bed. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the kind of person to invite danger into her home. And yet, danger had found her anyway. When police arrived at her house that night, they expected the usual signs of struggle: a shattered lamp, overturned furniture, anything that pointed to a break-in. But everything was undisturbed. No broken locks, no forced entry, no desperate fight for survival. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It was as if she had willingly let her killer in. But why? And who had been with her in those final moments? Investigators scoured her home for clues, searching for anything that could point to a motive or a suspect. At first, nothing stood out. No signs of a robbery. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. Cash and credit cards still inside. Valuables were in plain sight, undisturbed. If someone had broken in to steal, they had left empty-handed. But the brutality of the attack told a different story. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was personal. Someone had wanted her dead. Yet, as detectives combed through her life, they found no obvious enemies, no bitter exes, no ongoing disputes, no secret double life. Then, amidst the usual clutter of an ordinary life, bills, grocery lists, unopened mail, they noticed something small but strange: a KFC receipt. It was crumpled near the trash can, barely noticeable, but when an officer picked it up, something about it felt out of place. The timestamp. It had been printed just hours before the estimated time of death. It was a small detail, easy to overlook. But what if this simple piece of paper held the key to everything? At first glance, the receipt meant nothing. A leftover from dinner, a meaningless scrap of paper. But the more detectives thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Had she gone to KFC alone that night? If so, had someone followed her home? Or had she been with someone? Someone she trusted enough to let inside? The receipt had a location just a few miles away. If she had been there, maybe there were cameras. Maybe there was someone who remembered seeing her. Detectives grabbed the receipt and headed to the nearest KFC, hoping that this tiny, insignificant detail would crack the case wide open. The KFC was like any other bright fluorescent lights, the smell of fried food lingering in the air, employees moving mechanically behind the counter. It was just another shift, another night, and for the cashier, nothing had stood out. At first, the detectives' questions led nowhere. The cashier barely remembered the night in question. Too many customers, too many orders, all blending into the routine of fast food rushes. But then the detectives asked the most important question: "Do you have security cameras?" A manager nodded, leading them to the back office where a small monitor displayed a looping reel of past footage. It was grainy, the colors washed out, but the timestamp was there. The night of the murder. And there she was, the victim. Detectives watched as she stepped up to the counter, her expression neutral, her movements relaxed. She didn't seem distressed, didn't seem like someone afraid for her life. But then they saw something else. She wasn't alone. Right behind her, standing just a few feet away, was a man. And he wasn't just another customer waiting his turn. His body language told a different story, close, too close. His gaze flicked toward her, not in a casual, passing glance, but with intent. Then she turned slightly, said something to him, and smiled. This wasn't a stranger. Detectives leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. The footage wasn't high definition, but the shape of his face, his clothing, his stance, it was enough to know one thing. She knew him. And if she knew him, then maybe he was the last person to see her alive. Detectives leaned in, watching the screen as the grainy footage played out. The woman paid for her order, grabbed the brown paper bag of food, and turned to leave. But before stepping away from the counter, she looked up at the man behind her. She said something too quiet for the cameras to pick up, and then she smiled. It wasn't the kind of forced, polite smile you give a stranger in line. It was familiar, comfortable, a sign of recognition. The man responded with a slight nod, and then, as she walked toward the door, he followed, not hesitantly, not by accident, with purpose. This wasn't a chance encounter. They knew each other. And now detectives had their first real lead. The man on the footage wasn't immediately recognizable to police. He wasn't a known criminal. No outstanding warrants. No prior arrests. For a moment, it seemed like another dead end. But then detectives took the footage and ran it through facial recognition databases. They compared it to DMV records, social media profiles, anything that could turn a grainy image into a name. And they found one. A name that meant nothing to law enforcement until they started digging. That's when they uncovered something chilling. A pattern. And a history that, until now, had been ignored. The man had no history of violent crime, at least not on paper. But as detectives peeled back the layers of his past, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several women had reported him before, not for physical attacks, but for something more insidious, unsettling. He had a habit of lingering outside homes, lingering in parking lots, lingering in places where he wasn't wanted. Women recalled seeing him in their neighborhoods late at night, standing near their driveways, watching from a distance. Others mentioned finding him suddenly appearing at their workplaces, claiming it was just a coincidence. He never made direct threats, never touched them, just watched. And when police were called, there was little they could do. Because watching isn't a crime. Because making someone feel unsafe isn't the same as breaking the law. So he had walked away every time. Until now. Detectives needed more than a pattern, they needed proof. So they traced his movements on the night of the murder. Cell phone records painted a damning picture. At the time of the KFC purchase, he was exactly where he was supposed to be inside the restaurant, standing behind the victim. Minutes later, his phone pinged near her home. And then, nothing. No more calls, no texts, no location updates. It was as if he had gone dark. Surveillance cameras caught him leaving KFC shortly after her, walking out into the parking lot. But after that, he disappeared. Detectives knew they were onto something, but suspicion alone wouldn't be enough to make an arrest. They needed something concrete, something that could place him at the crime scene, something irrefutable. So they dug deeper. They pulled his phone records, searching for any late-night calls or messages that might reveal his movements. They scoured his bank transactions, looking for purchases that could tell them where he had been before and after the murder. And then they found it. A single transaction. One that confirmed he hadn't just crossed paths with the victim. He had been with her. The man had used his credit card to pay for his own meal at KFC. The timestamp, just minutes after the victim's receipt had been printed. It was undeniable now. They hadn't just been in the same place at the same time, he had been right there with her, standing inches away as she paid for her food. The last known moments of her life weren't spent alone. And now detectives had proof. But what they didn't have was an answer to the biggest question of all. What happened after they left? Detectives didn't waste any time. They had enough to bring him in for questioning, and they wanted to see how he would react. When he walked into the interrogation room, he looked calm, maybe even a little smug, like this was all just a misunderstanding, a minor inconvenience he would soon walk away from. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't seem nervous. And when they asked about the victim, his response was casual. He barely knew her, he said, just a passing acquaintance. Maybe they had exchanged a few words, but that was it. Nothing more. He had never been to her house, had no idea what happened to her. Then they pulled out the receipt. His demeanor shifted the moment he saw it. That easy confidence, the nonchalant attitude drained from his face. He sat up straighter, his fingers tapping the edge of the table, his eyes darting between the detectives and the paper in front of him. He stammered, tried to explain, said it was just a coincidence. Yeah, I was there. I mean, a lot of people eat at KFC, right? But there was no explaining away the surveillance footage. The images told a story he couldn't deny. He had stood behind her in line, had spoken to her, had followed her out, and now detectives had him exactly where they wanted him. For a while, he held his ground. He tried to act like none of it mattered, like detectives were wasting their time, like this was all some big misunderstanding. But the pressure was mounting. They went over the receipt again, the surveillance footage, the cell phone data that placed him near her home. They laid it all out piece by piece until the walls started closing in. And then something shifted. His breathing changed, his shoulders tensed, his gaze dropped to the table. And finally, he cracked. He admitted he had gone home with her that night, said she had invited him over, said they had just talked, nothing more. According to him, he had left after a while. No argument, no violence, no crime. Just two people sharing a conversation, and then he went home. But forensic evidence told a different story. The crime scene had been clean, almost too clean, but detectives knew where to look. And when they did, they found what they needed: traces of his DNA under her fingernails. It wasn't the kind of DNA that could be explained away. It wasn't from a handshake, wasn't from brushing against her by accident. It was the kind that told a darker story, a struggle, a desperate fight for survival. She had fought back, and now detectives had the proof. Just like that, the case wasn't cold anymore. It was over. And for the man who thought he had gotten away with murder, time had finally run out. The trial was swift, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The courtroom was packed. Family members, reporters, even townspeople who had never met the victim but had followed the case from the moment it hit the news. The atmosphere was tense, the kind of silence that made every shuffle of paper and every breath feel amplified. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the case piece by piece, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. First, the receipt. A single slip of paper discarded without a thought, yet holding the timestamp that placed him right there with her that night. Then the surveillance footage, the way he stood behind her in line, the way she turned to him, spoke to him, smiled at him. And then the most chilling part, the way he followed her out the door, moving with purpose. Finally, the DNA. Traces of his skin found under her fingernails. The last desperate act of a woman who had fought for her life, clawing at her attacker, leaving behind the only proof she could in her final moments. The defense tried to fight back. They claimed the DNA could have been transferred in an innocent way, that maybe he had brushed against her arm, or maybe she had grabbed his hand while talking. They suggested the surveillance footage showed nothing more than two people who happened to leave a restaurant at the same time. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. After just a few hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty. The word rang out in the courtroom, final and absolute. The man who had spent years lurking in the shadows, creeping around women's homes, following them, making them feel unsafe, but never quite doing enough to be arrested, he was finally where he belonged. He didn't react at first. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if refusing to process what had just happened. But the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched against the table, betrayed what was really happening inside his head. This wasn't how it was supposed to end for him. He had been careful. He had hidden in plain sight, slipping through the cracks of the justice system, leaving behind just enough fear to unsettle his past victims, but never enough to land him in a courtroom. But a simple KFC receipt had unraveled everything. A meaningless scrap of paper, something most people wouldn't even glance at twice, had been the key to taking down a murderer. And now he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the fact that he had been caught not because of some grand forensic breakthrough or a confession, but because he forgot to throw away his receipt. It made you wonder how many killers had walked free simply because no one had noticed the one tiny clue that could have changed everything. And how many more were still out there, one small mistake away from being exposed. It's eerie to think about how one tiny, crumpled piece of paper, something most of us wouldn't give a second thought, became the key to solving a brutal crime. Think about how many times a receipt is tossed into the trash without a glance. How often they end up stuck at the bottom of a purse, faded and unreadable, or swept away by the wind in a parking lot. They're meaningless until they're not. Had this receipt been thrown away, had it been lost under a couch cushion or blown out the door by a draft, had detectives overlooked it for even a moment, the case might have remained unsolved. The man who had spent years lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, he could have walked free. Maybe he would have moved on, tried to start fresh, knowing he had gotten away with murder. Or maybe, emboldened by the fact that no one had caught him, he would have done it again. One slip of paper, one timestamp. That was all it took to unravel his carefully crafted lies. But how many other cases have slipped through the cracks simply because the right clue, the crucial, overlooked detail, was never found? It makes you wonder. How many other cases remain unsolved, their answers buried in the smallest, most ordinary details? A train ticket discarded in a gutter, a voicemail deleted too soon, a single fingerprint smudged just enough to be useless. How many killers are still out there, living normal lives, blending in, simply because no one thought to look a little closer? And how many times has the truth been sitting right in front of us, waiting to be noticed? One receipt solved this case. What else have we missed? The first thing I saw when I opened the police report was a chilling detail. The victim's apartment was eerily pristine, too pristine. It was as if someone had tried to erase every trace of what had happened. Every inch of the place had been scrubbed, wiped, and polished, yet something felt deeply off about it. The furniture was pushed neatly into place, the floors gleamed, and there wasn't a single speck of dust or debris. It was too perfect. The kind of perfect you only see when someone is desperately trying to cover their tracks. But despite all the care taken to erase the crime, one thing remained: an object so simple, so ordinary, it didn't belong. A yellow sock, neatly folded, tucked under the bed, out of place. Why had this sock been left behind? And what did it have to do with the woman's death? I looked closer at the details of the scene. The apartment was on the second floor of a nondescript building, nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Munich, Germany. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to hint at the horror that had unfolded within those four walls. The curtains were drawn, the TV was still on, just a low hum of static in the background. It felt like a home, a place someone might come back to after a long day, a place that should have been safe. But something was terribly wrong. The crime scene had been scrubbed almost clean. The blood that had been spilled was wiped away with disturbing precision, like someone had thought to clean up after themselves, too much so. But there it was, the sock. One bright yellow sock, folded and tucked carefully under the bed. And that's when it hit me. The sock wasn't just an accident. It was a message. It was deliberate. But whose message was it? Her name was Anna, A young woman in her early 20s, living alone in that apartment in the quiet neighborhood. She had a modest life, just enough to get by, nothing lavish. A simple existence, but a peaceful one, or so it seemed. Anna was a graphic designer working for a small local firm. She was introverted, reserved, and kept to herself for the most part. Her neighbors described her as friendly, but quiet, never drawing attention to herself. She didn't go out much, preferring the comfort of her home. Most of her days were spent sketching in her art books, designing digital graphics, or watching films in the evenings. On rare occasions, she'd venture out to visit a cafe or to meet a friend, but those moments were few. From what I gathered, Anna wasn't involved in anything that would attract unwanted attention. No drugs, no shady characters, no secret life that could explain why someone might want to harm her. Her friends described her as a gentle soul, someone who could be counted on for a kind word or a listening ear. There was nothing in her background that screamed danger or conflict, but I couldn't help but wonder, was there more to Anna than met the eye? A dark secret hidden beneath that calm exterior? Or had she simply been an innocent victim of a random, tragic event? As I sifted through the details of her life, something felt off. A woman like Anna, living quietly, without any known enemies, shouldn't end up dead in her apartment, her life violently snuffed out. The more I looked into her routine, the more I started to ask myself, why had this happened to her? What was it that had led Anna into the path of the killer? And why, out of all the things that could have been left behind, was it a yellow sock neatly folded under her bed? But on the night of her death, something was different. Anna had made plans to meet a friend for drinks, a rare occurrence for someone like her. It was supposed to be a casual evening out, just a couple of drinks at a local pub. Anna had seemed excited, a welcome change from her usual routine of staying in. Her friend, a woman named Lena, arrived at Anna's apartment at the agreed time. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again. Still no answer. Lena checked her phone, thinking maybe Anna was running late. She tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. Concerned, but not yet alarmed, Lena waited outside for a few more minutes before deciding to leave. Anna wasn't the type to stand someone up, especially not on such a rare occasion. But when Lena didn't hear from her by the next morning, worry began to creep in. Anna had always been reliable, always quick to respond, whether it was to a text or a call. This silence was uncharacteristic. Lena tried calling her again, but this time there was still no answer. Her unease grew, and by midday she decided to visit Anna's apartment in person. Perhaps Anna had gotten caught up with something, maybe an emergency, or simply fallen asleep after a long day. But what Lena didn't know was that she would soon find herself part of a chilling mystery. The following afternoon, after a sleepless night filled with unanswered texts and missed calls, the building manager received a call from another tenant. The neighbor had reported a strange smell coming from Anna's apartment, a musty, unpleasant odor that had grown stronger throughout the morning. When the building manager arrived and tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Alarm bells went off. He called the authorities, and a few minutes later, the door was forced open. What they found inside made their stomachs turn. The apartment, which had once been neat and lived in, was now cold and still. But what struck them most wasn't just the eerie silence, but the trail of blood leading from the living room to the bedroom. It was thick, dark red, staining the wooden floorboards in a jagged, unnatural path. The bedroom door was ajar. The officers cautiously stepped forward, their hearts pounding in their chests as they slowly pushed it open. Inside the bedroom, Anna lay lifeless on the floor, her body positioned unnaturally, as if tossed carelessly aside. Her pale face stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open, frozen in terror. The blood around her was stark against the white sheets of the bed, as if she had been dragged into the room after being struck. The scene felt like something out of a nightmare, each detail more disturbing than the last. Anna's lifeless form, the silence of the apartment, the blood that had been spilled, it was a vision no one could easily forget. And yet, the most unnerving detail was the way the crime had been cleaned up, almost as if someone had tried to wipe the slate clean, but had forgotten to remove one final piece: the yellow sock. It was there, tucked under the bed, and it was the only clue left behind. The authorities arrived quickly, but as they began their investigation, it was clear that the scene was not what they had expected. The apartment was meticulously clean, too clean. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. Everything appeared untouched, like someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. The officers scanned the apartment for evidence, but everything seemed to be in place except for one thing: the sock, a single yellow sock tucked under the bed. Its color was too bright, too vivid, standing out against the otherwise neutral tones of the room. It didn't belong to Anna. It wasn't hers. In fact, it was almost unsettling how out of place it seemed. The sock was pristine, clean, and fresh, unlike anything else in the apartment. What made it even stranger was the fact that there was no label, no brand name, no size marker, nothing that could link it to any known store or product. It was just a simple yellow sock, but it felt deliberate, as if it had been planted there, left behind for someone to find. Why had it been tucked so carefully under the bed of all places? Had the killer left it behind on purpose, or was it some kind of mistaken afterthought in the midst of their crime? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this sock wasn't just an object. It was a clue. The question was, what did it mean? The investigators began to piece together Anna's life, hoping to find some kind of connection that could explain her death. Her friends, family, and coworkers were all interviewed, but no one seemed to have any answers. They were all shocked. No one could think of a single person who would want to harm Anna. She had been a quiet, reserved woman who didn't seem to have enemies. Her closest friends described her as kind-hearted, introverted, but never involved in any kind of drama. She didn't have a boyfriend, and there had been no recent relationships in her life. There were no reports of arguments or conflicts, no known tensions with anyone. Her life, while solitary, was simple and seemingly free of complication. So why had someone taken her life? The lack of evidence, combined with the bizarre scene in the apartment, only deepened the mystery. There was nothing to suggest a break-in or robbery. Nothing had been stolen. The apartment's pristine condition raised even more questions. It was as if someone had tried to erase any trace of the crime, but still they had left behind that one significant detail: the yellow sock. Was it a clue left by the killer, or just a random mistake? No one could explain it, and the more the investigators dug into Anna's life, the more they realized how little they truly knew about her. She kept to herself. She didn't open up much about her personal life. But this sock, this strange out-of-place sock, seemed to suggest something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Was it a sign that the killer knew her? Or was it just another part of a more twisted game? The sock was the only real clue they had, and it felt like the key to unraveling the entire case. But with no leads, no obvious suspects, and no real motive, the investigators were left to wonder: was this yellow sock an answer, or just another puzzle to solve? As the investigation continued, things started to unravel in unexpected ways. The yellow sock, initially appearing to be a simple clue, began to raise more questions than answers. The investigators were led to focus on the apartment's previous tenants, suspecting that one of them might have some connection to the crime. After all, the sock had no obvious link to Anna. It was the only item in the apartment that didn't belong to her. So the team started digging into the apartment's history. The first lead came from a man named Thomas, who had lived in the apartment before Anna. He had vacated the premises more than 6 months ago, and there had been no known contact between him and Anna during her time in the apartment. At first, his connection to the case didn't make sense. He wasn't on anyone's radar. But then something strange emerged. Thomas had recently been spotted in the area. Why would he have returned to the neighborhood after all this time? The police couldn't find any reason for his presence, and there was no indication he had been in contact with Anna at all. But his reappearance seemed too coincidental to ignore. What was he doing in the area so close to the time of Anna's murder? Was there a connection between Thomas and the yellow sock? The investigators were left with one glaring question. Had Thomas been a part of something much darker than anyone had realized? Then came the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The yellow sock, it turned out, was linked to an odd, inconspicuous store located just a few blocks away from Anna's apartment. The store wasn't anything special, just a small, unremarkable shop that sold a variety of goods, including socks, scarves, and other basic clothing items. But what caught the investigators' attention was the discovery that this particular yellow sock had been purchased there, and what was even more troubling, it wasn't from any regular line of merchandise. The store owner, when questioned, confirmed that the sock had been sold recently, but it wasn't from the standard inventory. The store kept a log of all sales, and it turned out that the sock had been bought just 3 days before Anna's murder. It was strange that such a specific item, one that seemed so mundane, had become a crucial piece of evidence. The sock, which had no label, no brand name, and no size marker, was now firmly tied to this store. What made it even more unsettling was the fact that it hadn't been purchased in bulk or as part of a normal transaction. It stood alone, an isolated item bought just days before Anna's tragic end. This discovery began to cast a new light on the case. Who had bought that sock? Why was it the only one of its kind? And why was it left behind in Anna's apartment? The store owner had no idea who had bought it, but there was one thing they did know for certain. The date of purchase matched the time frame perfectly. The sock was now part of the timeline leading up to the murder. Was it a clue left intentionally, or was it part of something even more sinister? The investigators were no closer to understanding the full picture, but one thing was certain: the yellow sock was no longer just an oddity. It was a key to the mystery. The deeper the investigators dug, the more twisted and disturbing the story became. At first, Thomas seemed like an unimportant lead, just a former tenant with no obvious connection to Anna. But as they began to scrutinize his background, something far darker started to emerge. Thomas had a criminal history, nothing too extreme, but enough to raise concerns. He had once been caught for a minor breaking and entering charge years before. It was a petty crime, a lapse in judgment, nothing that would have suggested a dangerous pattern of behavior. But as the investigators dug deeper into his past, they found more troubling details. Thomas had a history of strange behavior. Neighbors and friends described him as an odd, unpredictable man, someone who never seemed to fit in. He had no close friends and was often seen talking to himself in public. There were accounts of him visiting the local park late at night, lurking near the trees, staring off into the distance. Nothing overtly criminal, but certainly unsettling. Still, there was nothing that directly linked him to Anna or to her murder until the forensic examination of his possessions. The team had obtained a warrant to search his home, and that's when they found something that sent chills down their spines. Inside his apartment, the police discovered an unusual collection: several plastic bags, each containing different socks. These weren't just any socks. They were a mix of colors and styles, none of them ordinary. Some were brand new, some were clearly worn, and others had been meticulously washed and preserved. What was most bizarre, however, was the way they had been stored. Each sock was carefully labeled with a date. Thomas had kept track of every sock, treating them like artifacts. It wasn't until the investigators saw this collection that they realized the true nature of his obsession. What had initially seemed like an innocent lead now appeared to be a chilling compulsion. The discovery inside Thomas's home took a darker turn when the team began to examine the individual socks more closely. The collection wasn't just random, it had purpose, a twisted sort of organization. Among the socks, there was one that stood out, a yellow sock. This was no ordinary sock. It had been carefully removed from its plastic bag and placed on the floor in the living room. But what made it truly sinister was that this yellow sock, the one that matched the sock found in Anna's apartment, had recently been added to the collection. Thomas's obsession with socks was more than just a peculiar habit, it was a compulsion. As the investigators continued to dig into his life, they found that Thomas had been buying socks for years, hoarding them, cataloging them like trophies. Some of the socks in his collection were linked to incidents of strange behavior he had exhibited in the past, like following women in parks or showing up at local stores for hours just staring at the sock displays. But the yellow sock, the one he had placed in Anna's apartment, was different. It wasn't like the others. It seemed deliberately chosen. The timing of the purchase and the sock's deliberate placement in Anna's home sent a clear message. It wasn't just a random act, it was a calculated move. The sock had been left behind on purpose, as a signature of sorts. Thomas, it seemed, had been obsessed with Anna, and perhaps even with other women, for a long time. The yellow sock wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was part of his ritual, a final mark left on his victim. The investigators now had a clearer picture of the man they were dealing with. But what had driven him to take Anna's life? What had set him off that night? The questions only grew darker. But that wasn't all. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing revelations came to light. A search of Thomas's phone uncovered a string of unsettling messages. There, in the deep recesses of his text conversations, were several attempts to contact Anna. He had messaged her multiple times, trying to arrange a meeting, though she had never responded or even acknowledged his messages. At first glance, these messages appeared to be innocuous, a simple request to meet for coffee or a casual get-together, but the frequency and persistence of them were deeply unsettling. Anna, who had always been a private person, had clearly ignored his advances. But Thomas had kept trying, sending message after message, pushing her boundaries. The messages were filled with a strange sense of entitlement, as if he felt he was owed a piece of Anna's time. Each message grew more insistent, more desperate, until it became clear that Anna's refusal had triggered something in him, a deep, dark obsession. He wasn't just a man who wanted to be friends. He was someone who believed that she owed him attention, owed him something more. This wasn't the first time Thomas had crossed the line. He had done so before. But now it seemed that Anna's refusal had pushed him into a dangerous territory. The messages weren't just casual inquiries anymore, they were demands, veiled threats. But still, Anna had not responded. As the investigation unfolded, it became abundantly clear that Anna was not just an unfortunate victim in a random act of violence. She had been specifically targeted. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Anna had been the latest in a series of events, dark, twisted events that had taken place over several years. Thomas wasn't just stalking her, he had stalked others before her. Anna was his most recent victim, but he had been setting the stage for something like this for a long time. He had a pattern. It was almost like clockwork. He'd find a woman, observe her for weeks, learning her habits, becoming familiar with her routine. Then he'd wait for the perfect moment when she was most vulnerable, most likely to trust him. He'd manage to convince her to let her guard down. That was his trick, making them feel comfortable, safe before striking. Anna was no different. She had likely let him into her life unknowingly, thinking he was just another acquaintance. She didn't see the danger until it was too late. On that fateful night, Thomas entered Anna's apartment. How he got in, we still don't know for sure. Did he have a key, or did he find another way? The details of that night remain clouded in darkness. What we do know, however, is that once inside, he attacked her savage and brutal. It wasn't a crime of passion, but one that had been planned for months. He had stalked her, studied her, and when he finally struck, there was no mercy. Anna had been attacked with a blunt object, likely a hammer or a heavy piece of furniture. Her body was found sprawled on the floor, her blood staining the carpet beneath her, leaving a chilling testament to the violence she had endured. What was perhaps the most haunting part of the crime, though, wasn't just the act itself, but the cold calculation behind it. Once Anna had been struck down, Thomas had taken the time to clean the apartment, to erase his presence from the scene. He wanted to make sure no evidence of his identity remained. But there was one thing he couldn't control: the sock. The yellow sock placed deliberately under her bed, as if he had left it there for a reason. It was a final, disturbing touch. Was it a signature, a calling card, or something more? It was as though the sock was a part of his ritual, a last trace of his presence. He had left it behind for someone to find, perhaps to taunt the police, or perhaps as a mark of ownership over Anna. But in the end, it became his undoing. The sock, which seemed so innocuous at first, now stood as the key to unraveling everything. It wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate. It was Thomas's signature, his mark on the crime, and it was the clue that would lead investigators straight to him. The police pieced together Thomas's movements, slowly putting the puzzle together. After the brutal attack on Anna, he had taken his time to clean the crime scene with disturbing precision. He had scrubbed every surface, wiped down every inch of the apartment, and ensured that no trace of his presence remained. It was as though he was trying to erase every sign of what had happened to make it look like a perfect crime. But in a bizarre moment, there was one thing he couldn't bring himself to remove: the yellow sock. The sock had been left behind, tucked carefully under Anna's bed. Why? Was it a mistake? A slip-up in his otherwise calculated plan? Or was it something more sinister? The more the police looked at it, the more it began to feel like a calling card, an unmistakable sign that Thomas had left behind intentionally. Perhaps it was a twisted signature, something he could claim as his own. After all, the sock didn't fit in with the rest of the scene. It was the one piece of evidence that didn't match his obsessive cleaning, the one thing that remained untouched by his frenzy. It seemed almost like a final trace of his obsession, a mark left behind in a place that he had spent so much time, a place where he had stalked and studied his victim. The sock, so simple and ordinary in appearance, was in fact a glaring clue. It was the key to unraveling his involvement. The police had no doubt that Thomas had been inside Anna's apartment, but the question remained: why had he left the sock? It was the one detail that didn't make sense, and yet it was the thing that would eventually unravel everything. The case seemed solved. Thomas was arrested and charged with Anna's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the messages, the sock, the strange obsession with her. It all pointed to him. The yellow sock had become the pivotal clue, and it seemed like the investigation was finally drawing to a close. But there was still something unsettling about the way things had played out. It didn't feel as neat as it should have. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something didn't quite add up. The more I thought about it, the more I started to question the sock. It seemed too perfect, too planted. It was almost as if it had been left there on purpose, not by an impulsive killer, but by someone who was playing a far deeper game. It had been left with such deliberate care, almost like a trap, waiting for someone to notice it. Was it truly a mistake? Or had Thomas, who had gone to such lengths to cover his tracks, left it behind as part of a more elaborate plan? Was this yellow sock more than just a careless mistake, or was it the key to something darker? Something that still wasn't fully understood. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Perhaps the truth wasn't as simple as it seemed. Maybe the sock was just the beginning, a hint at something far more twisted lurking beneath the surface. Could it be that Thomas wasn't the only one involved in Anna's death? Or had the sock been planted by someone else, someone who was still out there, watching from the shadows? As I stared at the case files late one night, a final, unsettling thought crossed my mind. It was a thought I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it. Could this yellow sock have been planted to throw off investigators? I couldn't ignore the possibility. Everything about it seemed so perfectly out of place. It was as if someone had carefully positioned it, left it there to create a trail, a path that would lead the investigators right to Thomas. But what if Thomas wasn't the true killer? What if someone else had used him as a pawn in a much bigger game? Had Thomas really been the one who murdered Anna? Or was someone else still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew. What if Thomas had been the victim of a setup, a carefully crafted plan designed to make him the perfect suspect? What if there was another player in this twisted game, someone who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't seem to fit. There was something about Thomas, his obsession with socks, his strange behavior, that made him an easy target for suspicion. But what if he was just a red herring, a decoy meant to divert attention from the real killer? The questions kept swirling in my mind, and with every answer I found, more questions emerged. The sock, so simple, yet so complex, remained the key to unraveling this mystery. But had it been left there by Thomas or by someone else entirely? The thought gnawed at me, leaving me restless and uncertain. The more I examined the details of the case, the more questions I had. The sock, this seemingly innocuous item, was a key piece of evidence, yet it felt almost too obvious. It was so glaring, so perfectly placed. Could Thomas have been trying to lead investigators down the wrong path? Was he so confident in his obsession, so sure that the sock would be linked to him, that he left it deliberately as a sign of his involvement? Or was it simply a careless mistake, a moment of oversight in a crime he had planned so carefully? Each theory seemed plausible in its own right. The sock had been left behind with such intent that it almost felt like a clue, but one too obvious to be real. If Thomas had left it on purpose, then why not leave other clues? Why not make the scene even more suspicious, draw more attention to himself? Or had it been a panic-driven slip-up, something he hadn't meant to do but could never erase? It was a possibility. But then again, what if it wasn't Thomas at all? What if the sock had been planted by someone else? Someone who was manipulating the investigation from behind the scenes? That question lingered in the air, unanswered. The more I delved into the case, the more elusive the truth seemed. It was as if the answers were always just out of reach, slipping through my fingers like sand. The sock, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, was the key to everything. But whether it would unlock the full mystery, well, that was a question I didn't have an answer to. Not yet. The investigators spent weeks piecing everything together, but with every passing day, the case seemed to grow murkier. They had their prime suspect. They had Thomas. His obsession, his criminal history, the messages to Anna, and the bizarre socket all pointed toward him. They had enough evidence to make an arrest, to charge him with Anna's murder. Yet something didn't sit right. There was a lingering doubt, a sense that the story wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. The sock, that yellow sock, had become the linchpin of the investigation. It was the one piece of evidence that tied everything together. But did it really? Was it possible that there was more to this story, something deeper lurking beneath the surface? The investigators were starting to question if the sock itself contained a deeper meaning. Was it a symbol of Thomas's obsession, a twisted signature left behind to mark the crime, or was it a clue to something else entirely? As the investigation dragged on, they began to wonder if the sock was simply the work of a mind unraveling, a killer who wanted to leave a trace, to leave something that would haunt investigators long after the crime was solved. But then there was that nagging feeling. Was this sock, this seemingly insignificant object, more than just a signature? Was it something that could explain everything? The answers weren't clear, and with each new discovery, more questions seemed to arise. The more they learned, the more the mystery deepened. I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me. The more I examined the details, the more it consumed me. The socket seemed to hold all the answers, yet somehow it never felt like enough. Could it hold the key to unraveling this entire mystery, or had I too become obsessed just like Thomas? Had I let the simple act of finding a yellow sock cloud my judgment? The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if I was getting too close to the obsession that had overtaken Thomas. Was I chasing something that wasn't there, caught in a spiral of questions that couldn't be answered? Maybe in the end, it wasn't the sock that mattered. Maybe the truth was something deeper, something darker, and still hidden beneath the surface. Something I hadn't seen yet, something that couldn't be uncovered through simple clues or evidence. The sock may have been the key, but what if it was just part of a much larger story that I was missing? What if the real truth was even more horrifying than we could imagine? Was this a perfect crime, one that had been carefully orchestrated, leaving behind only a small trace to taunt the investigators? Or is the truth still out there, waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to see it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this story, like so many others, may never have a clean ending. The sock, the obsession, the murder, everything felt like a carefully constructed puzzle, one that might never truly be solved. But one thing was certain: someone, somewhere, still held the answers. And until those answers were uncovered, the mystery of the yellow sock would linger unresolved, haunting those who dared to search for the truth. It was just a crumpled napkin tossed away after a quick bite to eat. No one could have guessed that this insignificant scrap of paper, smeared with mustard and ketchup, would one day solve a brutal murder that had haunted an Iowa town for 25 years. A napkin, something so ordinary, so forgettable. But in the hands of forensic scientists, it became the key to unlocking a mystery that had gone unsolved for decades. For years, the case sat in the archives of West Liberty, Iowa, cold, forgotten. A crime with no answers, a killer walking free. But in 2018, detectives picked up that discarded napkin, tested it for DNA, and uncovered a secret that had been buried for over 2 decades. A secret that changed everything. October 10th, 1993. West Liberty, Iowa was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors. It was small, tight-knit. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where crime was rare, where murder was unthinkable. But that morning, something shattered the town's sense of security forever. Inside his rural home, Corey Winnick's lifeless body lay crumpled near his bed. His skull had been savagely bludgeoned, struck over and over with a force so brutal that police could barely recognize his face. Blood was everywhere on the floor, on the walls, soaking into the carpet. Whoever had killed Corey wanted to make sure he was dead. And yet, something about the scene didn't make sense. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken windows, no forced entry. His wallet was still there. His car keys, nothing had been stolen. This wasn't a robbery. This was personal. His fiancée was the one who found him. The moment she stepped inside, the silence felt wrong, thick, unnatural. When she called out his name and heard nothing, her stomach twisted in fear. Then she saw him. Her screams shattered the morning stillness. By the time first responders arrived, it was already too late. Corey had been dead for hours. The coroner would later confirm it. He had been murdered sometime in the early morning hours. But why? Who would want Corey Winnick dead? And why had they chosen such a brutal way to kill him? As investigators stood over the body, they had no idea that this case would haunt them for decades and that the answer had already been left behind, waiting to be found in the most unexpected place. Corey Winnick had a way of making people feel at home. At 35, he was a bartender at Wink's Tap, a local bar where everyone knew his name. With his boyish charm, quick wit, and friendly nature, he wasn't just a bartender. He was the guy people came to for a laugh, a drink, or just a good conversation. But Corey had bigger dreams. He wanted to own his own bar one day. He had talked about it for years, saving up, planning, imagining what it would be like to have a place of his own. His fiancée, who had been with him for years, supported him completely. They were planning a future together. So when she walked into their home that morning and found Corey's lifeless body on the floor, that future was instantly obliterated. Her screams cut through the morning air, a sound so raw and full of anguish that neighbors later said they would never forget it. Corey was gone, but his murder was just the beginning of a case that would twist and turn in ways no one could have imagined. The moment authorities stepped inside Corey's home, it was clear this was a brutal, rage-filled attack. His skull had been crushed, the blows delivered with terrifying force. This wasn't a quick, clean murder. Someone had beaten him to death over and over until there was no life left in him. Detectives searched the house for clues. The murder weapon was missing. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. His wallet was still in his pocket, his car keys untouched. This wasn't a burglary. This was personal. Investigators combed through Corey's life. They talked to his family, his friends, the regulars at the bar where he worked. Who would want him dead? The last person to see him alive was his fiancée. But her alibi was solid. She had been at work that morning miles away with multiple witnesses to confirm it. That meant someone else had been in that house, someone who had a reason to kill. In a small town like West Liberty, secrets don't stay buried for long. As detectives dug deeper into Corey Wieneck's life, a name kept coming up in hushed conversations: Annette Cahill. She wasn't just anyone. She was a local woman with a strong personality, outspoken, intense. More importantly, she had a history with Corey. Word around town suggested they had been more than just friends. Annette was reportedly having an affair with Corey, a relationship that had been passionate but also volatile. Investigators brought her in for questioning. Had she seen Corey on the night of his murder? Yes, she admitted she had been with him. But when asked if she had anything to do with his death, absolutely not. She insisted she had nothing to hide, no reason to hurt Corey. She claimed she had last seen him alive and well when she left. Detectives had their suspicions, but there was a problem. No physical evidence tied her to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon. They had nothing to hold her on. And just like that, Annette Cahill walked free. For weeks, investigators chased down leads, trying to piece together Corey Wieneck's final hours. They looked at his friends, his co-workers, his fiancée, his former lovers, but nothing led to a solid suspect. And then the case stalled. Months turned into years. Years turned into decades. West Liberty moved on. Corey Wieneck became another cold case, his name slowly fading into the stacks of unsolved murders. But then in 2017, something happened. A woman stepped forward with a chilling confession. She told police that back in 1993, she had been just a teenager when she overheard something terrifying. Annette Cahill admitting to murder. Detectives were stunned. For 25 years, Corey Wieneck's case had remained frozen in time, unsolved, untouched. But now a woman was claiming she had heard the killer confess. The witness, who had been a teenager in 1993, told investigators that Annette Cahill had once admitted to killing Corey in a fit of rage. According to the witness, Annette had been furious the night before Corey's murder. The two had argued, screamed at each other over another woman in Corey's life. Was this what had sparked the brutal attack? Had jealousy turned to murder? It was enough to reopen the case. Detectives went back to the evidence, searching for something, anything that could physically tie Annette to the crime. But there was nothing. No fingerprints, no blood, no hair fibers, no DNA. They had a statement, but no hard proof. If they wanted a conviction, they needed something solid. And that's when they took a risk. Detectives had one mission: get Annette Cahill's DNA. But it had to be done without her knowing. For months, they watched her from a distance, waiting for an opportunity. And then one day, they got their chance. Annette stopped for a snack, a hot dog. She ate, wiped her mouth with a napkin, then tossed it into the trash. That was it. The moment she walked away, detectives moved in. They retrieved the napkin stained with saliva, holding microscopic traces of her DNA, and sent it to the forensic lab. If Annette Cahill had been in Corey Winnick's home the night of his murder, this napkin might finally prove it. And when the results came back, everything changed. The forensic lab worked quickly, running tests on the discarded napkin. If Annette Cahill had anything to do with Corey Winnick's murder, her DNA needed to be at the crime scene. And then the results came back. A match. Annette Cahill's DNA was found at the scene of the crime. It was the break detectives had been waiting for. For 25 years, the case had been nothing more than theory and speculation. But now they had something undeniable scientific proof that placed Annette in Corey's home. Investigators wasted no time. The moment the results came in, they moved to make an arrest. Annette had no idea that in a single moment of carelessness, she had sealed her fate. May 31st, 2018. A knock at the door. Annette Cahill opened it to find detectives standing on her front porch. For more than 2 decades, she had lived her life without consequence, free from suspicion, free from justice. But now the past had caught up with her. That napkin, something so ordinary, so forgettable, had done what years of investigation couldn't. The evidence was clear, and this time Annette wasn't walking away. She was charged with second-degree murder. The trial that followed would finally uncover the truth behind Corey Winnick's brutal killing. But even as the courtroom filled with attorneys, witnesses, and forensic experts, one question remained. Would the jury believe she was guilty? 2019. After 25 years, Corey Winnick's case had finally made it to court. Annette Cahill sat in the defendant's chair, her face expressionless as prosecutors laid out their case. They painted a picture of jealousy and rage. The night before Corey was killed, Annette had been furious. Witnesses testified that she and Corey had a heated argument, a fight about his involvement with other women. Annette had been known for her fiery temper, and the prosecution argued that she had snapped. Had she picked up a blunt object in a fit of rage and beaten Corey to death? Had her jealousy turned to murder? The evidence was damning, but Annette's defense team was ready to fight back. Annette's attorneys didn't back down. They attacked the prosecution's case, pointing out its glaring weaknesses. There was no murder weapon. No eyewitnesses had seen Annette at Corey's home when he was killed. Yes, her DNA had been found at the crime scene, but she had already admitted to being there the night before. That wasn't proof that she had murdered Corey. The strongest evidence against Annette was a decades-old memory, a witness who claimed to have overheard her confess 25 years earlier. How reliable could that memory be? The defense called it speculation, not proof. Was the jury convinced? Or was there something more, a single piece of evidence that would push them toward a verdict? The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. For 25 years, Corey Wieneck's murder had remained a mystery. For decades, Annette Cahill had lived a normal life free from consequences. But now, everything came down to this moment. The jury had spent hours deliberating, going over the arguments, the evidence, the hot dog napkin that changed everything. Then they returned. The judge asked for the verdict. The courtroom fell silent. Guilty. Annette Cahill was convicted of second-degree murder. For the first time in decades, Corey Wieneck's family had an answer. Annette, now in her 50s, had spent more than half her life hiding a deadly secret. And in the end, it wasn't a witness, a confession, or even a motive that unraveled it. It was a crumpled napkin. For the town of West Liberty, Iowa, justice had been a long time coming. Corey Wieneck's family had spent years haunted by unanswered questions. His fiancée, his friends, his loved ones, none of them had ever truly moved on. Now, with a conviction, there was finally closure. But the case left behind unsettling questions. Had Annette really acted alone? What had truly happened in Corey's home that night? And most disturbing of all, if that napkin had never been thrown away, would Annette Cahill have ever been caught? This case proved one chilling fact: no crime is ever truly forgotten. For 25 years, Corey Wieneck's murder remained an unsolved mystery, buried beneath stacks of cold case files. Leads had dried up, witnesses had faded into the past, and the killer had walked free, believing she had escaped justice. But forensic science had other plans. In the 90s, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The technology simply wasn't there to match a suspect based on microscopic evidence. But science evolves. A simple, crumpled napkin, something Annette Cahill never thought twice about, became the key to her downfall. It's a reminder that in the modern world, murderers are running out of places to hide. Even the smallest trace, a hair, a drop of blood, a single fingerprint can come back to haunt them decades later. If authorities had access to today's forensic techniques in the 90s, would Annette Cahill have been caught years earlier? It's a disturbing question. Corey Wieneck's family waited 25 years for answers. 2.5 decades of grief, of uncertainty, of wondering if his killer would ever be brought to justice. But what if the technology had been available back then? Would Corey's loved ones have been spared the decades of pain? Would Annette have spent most of her life behind bars instead of walking free? It's an unsettling thought, because for every case solved by modern forensic breakthroughs, there are countless others still waiting for their own miracle of science. And the terrifying reality: some killers may still be out there believing they got away with it. For all the answers that forensic science provided in this case, one major mystery remains unsolved: the murder weapon was never found. Corey Wieneck was bludgeoned to death with brutal force, his skull shattered from multiple blows. But what object was used to deliver those fatal strikes? Investigators searched his home, the surrounding property, even nearby fields and wooded areas. Nothing. No bloodied baseball bat, no heavy metal object, no hammer, no crowbar, no blunt instrument that could have been the weapon. It simply disappeared. Could Annette Cahill have disposed of it so well that it was never recovered? Or could it still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found? And if it ever was, would it reveal something we don't yet know? Could it contain fingerprints or DNA from someone other than Annette? Because that leads to another haunting question. Annette Cahill was convicted of Corey Wieneck's murder. The jury believed she acted alone. But was she? Despite the guilty verdict, some still have doubts. Corey was a strong man, athletic, physically capable. The attack was ferocious, overwhelming, a savage beating that showed no hesitation. Could Annette have done this by herself? Or was there someone else in that house that night? Someone who never came forward. There was no forced entry, no struggle. Corey had let someone in. That much was clear. What if there was a second person, a silent accomplice, someone who helped cover up the crime and has lived in the shadows all these years? If that's true, then is Corey's case truly closed? Or is another murderer still out there, walking free? Corey Winnick's murder was solved in the most unexpected way, not by a hidden confession, a new witness, or a lucky break. It was a napkin, something so insignificant, so forgettable that Annette Cahill never thought twice about tossing it into the trash. And yet, that single careless action unraveled a secret she had kept for 25 years. It makes you wonder how many other killers have walked free simply because the right evidence was never found. For decades, Corey's case sat cold, buried beneath stacks of unsolved crimes. No leads, no suspects with enough proof to convict. It wasn't until a simple DNA test on a piece of garbage, no less, that detectives were able to bring his killer to justice. But what about the cases where that piece of evidence never turns up? How many murderers are still out there, living normal lives simply because they never made the same careless mistake Annette did? How many families are still waiting for answers, hoping that one day a tiny overlooked clue will surface and change everything? And the most unsettling thought of all, how many more hot dog napkins are still out there waiting to be found? A scrap of paper, a cigarette butt, a discarded straw, something so small it seems meaningless, but could hold the key to unlocking another horrifying crime. This case proved that justice is patient. It waits in forgotten evidence bags, in DNA databases, in samples that haven't been tested yet. One day, another cold case will be cracked, and another killer will learn the same lesson Annette Cahill did: no crime stays buried forever. The case of Corey Winnick is officially closed. Annette Cahill is behind bars, serving her sentence. The jury made its decision. The evidence sealed her fate. But there's one question we can't ignore. If she had never tossed that napkin, would she have ever been caught? Think about it. Without that napkin, detectives had nothing. A cold case, an old witness statement, a missing murder weapon. That's all they had for 25 years. Would Corey's family still be waiting for justice if Annette had been just a little more careful? And even more chilling, how many others are out there living their lives thinking they got away with murder, walking among us, smiling at neighbors, tucking their children into bed, thinking their secrets will never come to light. But as Corey Winnick's case proved, all it takes is one mistake, one trace of DNA, one forgotten piece of evidence, and justice will come knocking.